So the topic for today is right livelihood, the fifth stage of the Eightfold Path. But before we get on to that, I thought perhaps we'd do a little recap of the ground we've covered so far. It's easy to lose one's way doing this 1 week at a time and to forget where we were. So the Eightfold Path, if you remember back to the first week when we looked at it, has two, if you like, two dimensions to it. There's the Transcendental Eightfold Path, which is an expression, we could say an expression of the way that an enlightened being would naturally behave. It's just the way that an enlightened being is. And they give expression to these various behaviors, which is why Bhante, when he talks about the Transcendental Eightfold Path, calls it the path of perfection. So it starts with perfect vision and moves on to perfect emotion or intention, perfect speech, perfect actions, and so on. But of course, we're not enlightened beings, and we couldn't really, I guess, describe our actions, our behaviors as perfect in any way, shape or form, even though we are trying. And that's the essence, I think, of the Eightfold Path, as far as we're concerned. The mundane Eightfold Path, if you like, it's the path of practice, it's the path of discipline, it's the path of progression towards that enlightened state. And very often, the path is, the stages of the path are listed as being right view, right emotion, right intention, right speech, and so on, rather than perfect. So that's the aspect of the path that we're looking at. It's the mundane path, because obviously this is where our working ground is. But the mundane path itself can be viewed as having two major elements to it. If we could have the first slide, please, Ed. So we can see the Eightfold Path as being a path of vision and a path of transformation. And in fact, early editions of the book that was compiled from Sangha lectures on the Eightfold Path is actually called Vision and Transformation. I think its later reprints are simply called the Noble Eightfold Path. So we have the path of vision, the first stage. It's what gets us started on the path. We have this insight, or this vision, this sort of glimmering of an understanding that there's something significant in the Dharma for us. And we spoke about this obviously a few weeks ago, how that may be just a general feeling of, oh, there's something interesting here, I think I'll follow this up, or yeah, something quite maybe quite small, even fairly insignificant, that just attracts us to the Buddha's teachings, to the Dharma in the first place. And that, whatever it is, no matter how small it was, no matter how seemingly insignificant it was the beginnings of right view. And the rest of the path, the remaining 7 stages, are the process of that right view filtering down into the whole of our lives, into the whole of our beings. As we transform every aspect to ourselves in the light of that view, that vision, that insight that got us started. Of course, this isn't a single sort of sequential process that we have the right view, then work down the other 7 stages, and lo and behold, at the end, we get the certificate and hey, you're enlightened. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. But what happens is that we go round and round again and again and again. It's kind of a positive feedback loop, if you like. So on the basis of our initial view or vision, we then apply that to transformation of ourselves as far as it goes. And in that process of transformation, our insight, our view, our vision becomes a bit clearer and a bit deeper. So we then apply that deeper insight to ourselves again, and we go through the process. And then in going through that process, the vision, the insight becomes deeper and stronger, and so on. And we keep going around and around and around. And the path of transformation itself is not necessarily, well, it isn't a linear process. It's not that we start with right emotion. Well, we do start with right emotion, but it's not that we perfect right emotion and then go on to right speech and perfect that, and then go on to right action and perfect that. We'll find ourselves working on any one of these 7 stages or several of them at the same time. We could jump from one to another. It's not as neat and as tidy as it looks when it's put down on paper like this. In fact, I personally, I'd like, rather than the linear path model, I like the analogy of an unfolding flower, like a lotus slowly opening. And the Buddha himself, in fact, used the analogy of lotuses in relation to people's spiritual condition when he was considering, after his enlightenment, whether or not to teach. And he had a vision of people being like lotuses. Some were still below the surface of the water, completely ensnared in their mundane existence. Others were kind of just floating on the surface of the water and beginning to open up. And others were standing completely clear of the water and more or less fully opened. And this is, I think, it's a lovely picture of our own spiritual lives. Well, it works for me. This idea of being like a lotus flower that's slowly unfurling its petals. And it doesn't do it one petal at a time. It opens up sequentially from the outside, moving in towards the center, towards the heart. And we can see the path of transformation as being like that, if you like, rather than perhaps a more colder conceptual sort of almost spreadsheet-like set of stages that we have to tick off one by one. So the first aspect that we work on, right emotion, or right intention, it's sometimes translated at. It comes first because, in a way, if we don't work on the transformation of those deep emotional drives, we're not going to get very far with the rest of the path. When we speak of right emotion here, we're not talking about emotion in terms of our mood or our passing fancy or whatever, but these are these deep drives that we have within us, basically greed, hatred, and delusion, that drive our behaviors. Very often subconsciously, beneath our sort of rational awareness. It's the desires of craving and ill will. So it's transforming emotions on that level that we have to work on in order that we can fully engage with the rest of the path. But of course, as I said, we don't perfect emotion before we go on to anything else. This is, we have a little bit of a change in our deeper emotions, which enables us to engage to some extent with the rest of the path, and then we repeat that process over and over again. So with that initial transformation starting on our deep emotional selves, we can engage to some extent with the other aspects of the path. So we start to transform our communication. We start, in traditional terms, it's spoken of as speech, but of course communication nowadays is on many levels other than speech. In the Buddha's day, the vast majority of people wouldn't have been able to read or write, wouldn't have felt much need for it, actually. The Buddhist society was very much an oral tradition. So speech was, for many, the only means of communication. And even now, for us, of course, speech is our main means of communication. But as we probably well know, we have, thanks to technology, many other ways of communicating, and therefore many other ways of causing harm and damage as well. So we start to work on transforming our communication, developing right speech in all its forms. And the Buddha identified that basically as being speech that is truthful, speech that is kindly, speech that is helpful, and speech that is harmonious. So along with speech, we work on our actions. And we heard something about this last week from Prasada Vadri. So we start to transform our actions, perhaps best seen in terms of the 5 precepts, but you can take out the speech one because that gets its own category here. It's so important. But the other 4 precepts are really what comes under right action. Behaving with loving kindness, with generosity, developing a sense of stillness, simplicity, and contentment, and having an awareness, a deepening mindfulness around everything that we're doing. So all of that comes under this heading of right action. So those aspects, speech, emotion, speech, action, are very much centered on ourselves. This is what we do in terms of our how we transform our separate individual selves, without wishing to attach any sort of permanent significance to that term self. So but yeah, this is how we approach if you like, the individual aspect of transformation. Sangha actually takes a very I think quite a radical view of the stage of right livelihood, because he sees it as being representative of our actions in terms of society at large. So this is more about collective action. Okay, you can take that slide down now, I think, Ed. So right livelihood we can see as being, if you like, the umbrella that covers all of our actions that have an impact at the level of society. So it's more collective as well as individual in its approach. So throughout history, philosophers, thinkers, even poets have had much to say about the ideal society. We go right back to Plato and his writings on the Republic. Perhaps one of the earliest examples we have of an idea of the perfect or the utopian society. And there have been many writers throughout, both ancient and modern, who've written about the ideal society or utopias in various ways. And Buddhism too has its vision of the ideal society. Buddhism has a view of what the perfect society would be, what it would look like, if you like, a Buddhist utopia. And that can be represented by the archetypal and symbolic image of the Pure Land, which you may have come across in some of your readings or studies. That there is this representation, certainly in later Buddhist writings, of the Pure Land, and it's presented in very beautiful symbolic terms, how the Pure Land would look, trees made of jewels and so on and so forth, and everything rich colors and beautiful sounds, and absolute perfection wherever you look, where there's nothing else to do except sit and listen to the Dharma all day, because all your wants are automatically met. You only have to think that you want food, and food arrives for you. It's it's very, very symbolic, but it represents, if you like, this idea of the ideal society in Buddhist terms. But of course, with Buddhism, it doesn't just stop at simply imagining what this society might be like, but Buddhism sets out to actively create this perfect society in the here and now. So we might ask, well, why? Why should we be concerned with creating an ideal society? Surely, surely you've been telling us week after week after week that the point of our Buddhist practice is to transform ourselves, which is very true. Of course, we have to transform ourselves, but the society in which we live has a significant impact on how we can practice the Dharma life. One can see perhaps the ideal society, or the Buddhist Pure Land, as being setting up the best possible conditions for us to practice the Dharma, not just for us, but for all beings to practice the Dharma, because we're all affected by the society that we live in. And if that society the values of that society are contrary to Buddhist values, and I would suggest that the values of our current society are by and large contrary to Buddhist values. If society is constantly promoting greed and the importance of the individual over and above everything else, society constantly asserting aggressive behaviors towards anything and anyone that stands in our way, then we have a society that just makes leading the Dharma life so much more difficult than it could be. If we're constantly having to push back against the pressures of society, then that makes leading a Dharma life more difficult for us. So if we were living in the ideal society where practicing the Dharma was seen as natural and normal and the thing that everyone did, how much easier would that be if we didn't have to constantly resist the pressures to earn and spend and buy and throw away all the time? It's almost unimaginable actually to think of what it would be like to practice Dharma under those conditions. And I think it's a testament to all of us that we're able to practice the Dharma under the difficult conditions that we do have to. And of course, those conditions could be worse. At least we have the freedom to practice in some, in the political sense, that we're not constrained in that way, as some societies are. But even so, it's difficult to practice as effectively as we might like, given the society that we live in. In the early days of Triratna, or FWBO as it was then, a very common theme that was talked about was the new society. In fact, there's even a book called The New Society. Sangha and others around him had this vision of creating in miniature this new society based entirely on Buddhist values, where the focus was on leading a Dharma life and setting up the ideal conditions for that. It's really interesting and fascinating, I think. It's something we don't hear about so much these days, but I think the spirit of it is still alive. It may be under sort of a great deal of pressure nowadays, but the spirit of the new society is still there at the heart of Triratna. I haven't got time this morning to go into that too deeply, but it's just good to know that it is there, and it is, it's in our collective consciousness, I think. So Bhante identified three aspects of our collective life: the social aspect, the political aspect, and the economic aspect. And Buddhism has teachings on these aspects. They're generally, obviously, in the context of life in ancient India, because that's when the Buddha gave these teachings. There's a sutta called the Sigalavoda Sutta, where the Buddha, speaking to a young man, Sigalaka, sets out all of these conditions for creating the best possible social, political and economic life that one could lead in those times. And it's a really interesting sutta, well worth reading. But of course, that has to be updated for our modern times. So the Buddha didn't just speak about practice on an individual level, but in this sutta, the Buddha spoke about, for example, the responsibilities that an employer has towards his employees, and vice versa, the responsibilities and duties that the employee had towards the employer, the responsibilities and duties that a husband had towards wife and children, and the responsibilities, duties that a wife has towards a husband and children, and likewise the responsibilities of children towards their parents, and so on. And the Buddha goes through all of these different relationships that are the relationships that we all have. They haven't really changed in those 2,500 years. And he speaks about the responsibilities and duties that each party to the relationship has towards the other. What I find fascinating about that is that the Buddha doesn't talk about rights. In fact, I've never come across, and I haven't read everything the Buddha said, but I've never come across an occasion where the Buddha speaks about what rights we have The Buddha always speaks in terms of responsibilities and duties. And I just think how much different public debate, political debate would be nowadays if we could get away from talking about rights and focus on responsibilities and duties. Everyone clamoring for their own rights doesn't get us anywhere. It just leads to confrontation and conflict, as we can see in almost any sphere of activity these days. Because insisting on my rights automatically means that someone else has to be denied their rights, which might be contrary to my rights. Whereas if we focus on our responsibilities and duties towards each other, and things would run so much easier if we were more concerned about what we can do for someone else rather than what we can get for ourselves. Society would be immeasurably better. So this brings us on to the topic. It's taken me a long while to get there, but of right livelihood. So hopefully we've set the background for looking at right livelihood. If we could have the next slide, please, Ed. So the Buddha spoke obviously about right livelihood. More particularly, is rather sort of enigmatic in the way. If you read the sutta, it says, "And what is right livelihood?" Well, right livelihood is not wrong livelihood. And it really leaves it at that. But then the sutta goes on. The Buddha goes on to explain or give some examples of wrong livelihood. In a way, I think it was the Buddha just saying, "Look, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to lay down rules about what your livelihood should be, but I can point out to you some forms of livelihood that are not right, and you can work the rest of it out for yourself from this." I mean, it's kind of obvious, really. But so the Buddha mentioned, amongst others, he mentioned these. I've only picked out some of them because the list goes on a bit, and it's not meant to be a definitive list. It's just an example anyway. So the Buddha spoke about, it's wrong livelihood to traffic in living beings, both humans and animals, particularly animals for slaughter. Human beings, well, slavery was a feature of ancient India, as it was and has been of cultures throughout the ages. So that is most definitely wrong livelihood. Earning one's living as a butcher or a seller of meat is wrong livelihood. Hopefully this is quite obvious why these are wrong livelihood. I mean, they explicitly involve behaviors that are contrary to the precepts. A purveyor of poisons is wrong livelihood. So yeah, you can't go around dropping poison into your enemy's glass of wine. So, selling intoxicants is a wrong livelihood, because you're earning your living from causing harm to other beings. Dealing in weapons of war, so in both their manufacture and their selling, is a wrong livelihood. Palmistry and fortune telling, so yeah, it's wrong livelihood, the Buddha tells us. You might wonder why. And I think the connection there, of course, is that it's based on a fatalistic or nihilistic viewpoint that what's going to happen to us is immutably written into the stars, or however else one wishes to divine fortunes. And of course, it negates the Buddhist view of personal responsibility. So the Buddha was quite emphatic, what's going to happen to us can't be foretold from the lines in our palm or the alignment of the stars when we were born. What's going to happen to us is dependent on how we behave here and now. And that's what's significant. Okay, thanks, Ed. We're done with that one. So there the Buddha's drawing on the underlying principles for right livelihood, which are essentially the precepts. And in our modern day situation, of course, I'm sure we can come up with a much longer list of wrong livelihoods. The opportunity for wrong livelihood is just out there all over the place if we want to look for it. I'm not going to go through a list, don't worry, it would take far too long. So Sangha, in looking at our present day situation, came up with 3 areas to look at in terms of livelihood. We should look at occupation, vocation, and duration. Well, here's three terms. That's occupation, vocation, and duration. So firstly, under occupation, Sangha pointed out that, well, there are four categories. Firstly, those occupations which cannot be right under any circumstances. For example, from that previous list we had from the sutta, working in a slaughterhouse, killing animals, it cannot be right, quite simply, in terms of the precepts. You cannot come up with an excuse for that makes it right. It's harmful, it's causing harm, it's killing other beings. And there are other categories which would also come under that heading. Secondly, there are occupations which may not appear on the surface to be harmful, but they do lead to harm further down the line, or there's hidden harm in them. Sangha again gives us an example, working in the advertising industry, which is there promoting greed and craving. So yeah, it's not immediately harmful in what it does, but the effect it has on people is harmful. The states of mind that it creates are harmful. Thirdly, there are those occupations that can be right livelihood if we engage with them in the right way and with the right attitude. And again, Sangha gives an example for working in an office, working as an administrator, perhaps in a business that provides a useful or a necessary service. We may not think of that, if we're working in an office, that it could, it's kind of neutral, isn't it? But it really relates to, well, what is the biggest picture? What are we serving here? What are we facilitating in the job that we're doing? And then finally, under occupation, Bhante says that we should consider that what we're doing may not be ethical, unskillful at all. It may be skillful, but it may make such heavy demands on our time and our energy that there's nothing left over for our practice of the Dharma. And so that, in a way, makes that particular occupation unhelpful to us, even though it's not necessarily unskillful. The second category is a vocation. And quite simply, Bhante describes a vocation as an occupation that is directly related to what one considers as being of ultimate importance in one's own life. And Bhante describes a vocation as being the perfect form of right livelihood, as it were. And as examples, he talks about the medical profession or the teaching profession. And that's not an exclusive list. We could add others to that, I'm sure. And then finally, Bhante talks about the duration. Perhaps the most contentious of his thoughts on livelihood. And he says quite clearly, and he's giving this was given to a talk, I think, in the late 1960s. He says that one should devote as little time as possible to earning one's living, so that one can have as much time as possible for practicing the Dharma. So, yeah, as little time as possible should be devoted towards earning one's living, in the sense that our livelihood is there to support us, and we don't need to, or really don't need to spend any more time on it than we have to spend in order to support ourselves to lead a very simple Buddhist lifestyle. If we're devoting sort of 15 hours a day working in a high-powered job to earn a massive salary, and we're too exhausted to meditate at the end of the day, then it's not a good lifestyle. It's not a good livelihood for us, because it's we're throwing away the opportunity to practice the Dharma in return for just financial gain, financial reward. So Bhante's stressing there that the driving force behind our livelihood should ideally not be financial. It's not that Buddhism has anything against wealth. The Buddha didn't speak against wealth. He often actually spoke in praise of righteous wealth, righteously acquired, I think is the term that often crops up in the suttas. And that I think is the key, that there's nothing wrong with earning money. It's how you earn it and what you do with it that is of importance, and what the impact of that is on the rest of your life. Anyway, I've gone way over time, so I'm going to stop